Dear friends, it's my great pleasure today to speak to Douglas Abrams, and he's the co-author of this amazing book, The Book of Hope, with Jane Goodall. So first of all, congratulations, Doug.
Thank you so much, Deepak. It's so great to be with you.
I've been going through the book and really enjoying it. I've met Jane a few times. I've known her since I first met her at the State of the World Forum with Gorbachev, like 30 years ago or something. And
Amazing.
then periodically in Europe through common mutual friend, Fred Matzer. And then actually she was on my podcast a while back as well. So tell me about this project. How did this come about?
Well, first of all, I am a poor substitute for Jane herself, but it's a delight to be with you and to represent the book and share this amazing conversation that I got to have with Jane. We have a global icon series that you may know about. So the first book in the series was the Book of Joy with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. Yes. And so when we were thinking about who next to profile in the series and have a conversation with, and these books are kind of dialogue travelogues. So they're a kind of, we take the reader on an adventure to go meet one of the most extraordinary icons in the world, one of the most extraordinary people in the world, and dive very deep into a subject of profound importance, in this case, hope. And little did we know how much the world was going to be hurting and needing hope when we began 2 years ago. But I approached Jane and she said she wanted to do the book. And she actually told us 2 weeks in advance that she wanted us to come to Tanzania and meet with her. So packed my bags and went off to her home in Dar es Salaam and got to sit down and have a fantastic conversation with her.
So all this was in person, not through remote computer.
So it started in Tanzania in person, and then in Europe in person, and then when the pandemic hit, then like everyone, we were locked down and required to do it remotely like this.
What was your experience doing this?
Well, let me say this was a very personal journey as well as an intellectual journey, because my dad died while I was working on the book. And I was actually in Tanzania with Jane in Dar es Salaam when I got the call from my wife that my dad had gone into the hospital. And then, hope went from being an intellectual kind of topic to everything, as we were waiting on his diagnosis and waiting for him to and ultimately found out that he had T-cell lymphoma that was quite aggressive. And so while we were working on the book, I was flying back and forth between California and New York to be with him in the hospital. And my son also had a traumatic brain injury and at that time. And so I was kind of going back and forth between them and working on the book. And then obviously everything happened in the world as well around the pandemic and climate crises. And so I think the book is a really, the desire was to really explore with Jane the first book about the most curious and strange and fascinating ape, which is the human, the Homo sapien, and what it is in our nature that could give us hope, and what it is in the natural world that she has explored that could be most hopeful for us. And it was just, I think at that time when I was so much in need of hope, and then obviously as we as a world were so in need of hope, it felt like a great privilege and joy to be able to sit with her and hear directly what she had to say.
So, I'm still reading the book. I just got it a couple of days ago. Mm-hmm. And, I have a couple of questions. You start right in the beginning. So what is hope? Can science explain hope? How do we have hope in trying times?
Mhm.
So is there any other species, any other primate, now that we talking about Jane, would know? Or
Yeah.
is it just Homo sapiens that has this experience that we call hope?
It's fascinating. I asked her the same question, and she said, well, if you think about your dog waiting at the door for you to come home, that's a form of hope. That's that kind of ability to expect the future or anticipate the future. But we are the only animal who can hope for the distant future. So, what we learned from the hope studies research field was that hope actually is located you'll know more about this than I will, but in the prefrontal cortex, in the PFC, where we have language, where we have time travel, where we have problem solving. So this part of the brain, which seems to be most extraordinarily well developed in human beings and in the human ape, is this prefrontal cortex, that kind of the human brain, if you will. And that hope seems to be deeply connected with problem solving, with language, and with this ability to anticipate the future, what was called time travel. And so we really are the only species that has it developed to this full extent. And one of the things that Jane called hope was a human survival trait. And that ultimately hope is this aspect of our human nature, which is absolutely fundamental to our survival. One of the hope researchers we looked at says that we are hope fear creatures. And so we either are responding from our kind of ancient reptilian fear brain, or we're responding from our most evolved, newest hope brain.
I've been a student of what is called the hard problem of consciousness. So while you talk very eloquently about the prefrontal cortex, hope is actually a spiritual experience that comes with self-awareness, and also contrast to what we call despair.
Yes.
Despair and hope go together, and part of the human imagination, which is also time travel. And the brain actually is the neural correlate of this experience in awareness. So is language center, a neural correlate of the ability of human awareness to structure symbolic representation of experience. The neural correlates, of course, are not the source of the experience. The source is awareness. But you make a very good point that as we get to be more self-aware, then we find that these are mental constructs that actually improve biological survival. This is fascinating. That awareness, self-awareness, which is actually a spiritual trait, has a direct effect on not only our brain, but our biology in general. So as I was reading this, all these amazing, I just want our readers to know, our listeners to know, or those people who are watching, that I'm having a conversation with Douglas Abrams, who's co-written this book with Jane Goodall. It's called The Book of Hope, and it's part of a series of books that started with the Book of Joy with His Holiness Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I believe Lynn Franklin was the agent for that book, if I remember.
Yeah, I worked closely with Lynn on all of Archbishop Tutu's books. So yeah, it's wonderful. A dear friend of ours who just passed away.
Yeah, very close friend, known her for 35 years. So as people will hopefully get a lot out of this book. But as we go through most of these chapters, if you don't mind, I just want to read the headlines for our audience so they know what to expect. So the first part of the book is called "What is Hope?" Whiskey and Swahili bean sauce. I guess that's an encounter, right?
We had yes, in Tanzania.
in Tanzania. Is hope real? And the answer is, of course. Have you ever lost hope? I think there are periods when all of us feel despair. How do we have hope in trying times? By actually surrendering to the trying times. You know, these days everybody's talking about the pandemic and what a disaster it is. I was thinking every generation has had their quotient of disasters. We had the Second World War, we had the Great Depression, we had the First World War.
Mhm.
Look at the history of humanity. Always there's been a global crisis somewhere or the other. And so this wasn't unique. But right now, as I read this book, I also feel that we're living in a world where there is war, terrorism, eco destruction, climate change, extinction of species, um, poison in our food chain, and extreme social and economic injustice, racism, bigotry, hatred, mechanized ways of killing each other. Is there any reason to hope right now with this insanity of our collective culture? Because the way it's going, it looks like we have 5 minutes to midnight. You know, any of these things could bring about extinction. Last extinction was 65 million years ago, thanks to a meteorite that fell. But the next could be any one of these, you know, but climate change itself, or nuclear explosion, or you know, some accident in any of those things. And you know, we're killing ourselves even with the food that we eat, and the way we produce food, and the way we treat other species. Is there a legitimate, sane reason for hope right now, and why? I mean, can we do anything about these big issues? Can we actually hope for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world? Uh, can we even dream about it? And can we create that collective intentionality or collective love in action, or some process where we can actually tackle these problems? Because these, you know, the more I look at these problems, including climate change, and you know, the fact that we have destroyed the microbiome, genetic information and of the earth, with all the industrial food production and chemicals in our food chain, we know that all these things are reversible. But to have hope, we need an emotional story. The facts are not doing it. So share with me how this book can help us look at these big problems that our collective insanity has created. I mean, if you don't think all this is insane, then we are declaring our own insanity.
Well, let me begin by saying that I was very skeptical about hope when I began working on the book with Jane. You might say even cynical. I'm from New York. We don't do hope in New York. We do fear, anger, outrage, cynicism. These are the things we're much more comfortable with. And I know you are now in New York, so you understand what I'm talking about. And so I had to be convinced, let's put it that way, and I think one of the things that's important to say is that hope often is thought of as and this was my prejudice, I think, as well, is a kind of weak or soft, or thing, like let's hope for the best, that kind of, it's a kind of Pollyanna response to reality. And what I learned from Jane is that hope is actually not real without action. So it's not, and when we went to the field of hope studies, and what they talk about is that hope is actually different. There are kind of three things that you do in response to the future. You either fantasize, right? Like, I'm going to be an NBA basketball player. That's a fantasy, right? There's no reality to that. If you saw how coordinated I was, even though I'm 6'6", so I should have some possibility, but no. So then there's dwelling, which is basically kind of brooding and worrying and ruminating about the future. That's what we do in New York a lot. And then there's a third response, which is hoping. But hoping is actually a grounded way of relating to the future that anticipates obstacles, anticipates adversity, and strategizes and plans. So one of the things that was fascinating, and I think this is just useful context before we get into the big problems that you described so powerfully and eloquently. And so hope needs four things, according to the research. It needs goals, realistic goals. It needs realistic pathways. It needs a sense of agency or confidence that we can achieve those goals and follow those pathways. And it needs social support. Those are the four things that lead to hope in our individual lives or in our world. So the question that you're asking, which is with these great, challenges that we face, is there hope? And like we'd obviously have to take each one, for its in its own right to explore it in detail. But what I would say is, as Jane says, there is always hope until we're gone. Either we're dead or or the species is extinct. And then ultimately there's hope for the world that will continue with or without us, whether we earn our place in the long line of species on this planet. And that's one of the things I asked her. 99.9% of all species have gone extinct. What's different about humans? Why won't we go extinct as well? And obviously we talk about that in great detail in the book. And Jane really felt that there are four things that give her hope, and we can talk about those four things. And they're both for the climate and environmental crisis, but I think they're also what gives her hope in relationship to these other challenges that you face. One thing that is for sure is that if we don't have hope, there really is no hope. Right. So, basically, it's so easy to go from denial to despair about any of the things that you've just raised. Right. And so a big part of what Jane is calling us to in the Book of Hope is to find that middle ground between denial and despair, which is an active, creative, and practical response to the challenges of the day. And I think you said it very powerfully, Deepak, at the beginning of what you were saying, of like, it seems that in this world and this place that we all have incarnated as human beings, that the nature of this reality is not suffering free. It is not adversity free. In fact, what we find is when children don't have enough adversity, enough challenge in their life, often they don't grow and they don't develop well. And that's because I think there's something about this experience of being human, as Archbishop Tutu or the Dalai Lama would say, that, I think Archbishop Tutu said it beautifully, where he said it's like, building muscles. It takes time for us to become human, and that adversity, those challenges actually build our spiritual capacity, build our emotional capacity, and develop our ability. So I guess to come back to your question, there is, we can take each of them in specific, but I would say one other thing that I think is is relevant to this which is that we like to think that somehow life should be an unending yoga class, like it should all be just sublime and beautiful. And in fact, that adversity is part of what strengthens us. And there's one fascinating thing. We've also done a book with Christiana Figueres, who did the Paris Climate Treaty. One of the most amazing people on the planet as well. We did a book with her and Tom Karnak, and together they were kind of the architects of the Paris Climate Treaty, getting 190 countries to do the right thing, right? At a time where people were hopeless about the fact that the world could act on climate. And what she said is that hope, or as she calls it, stubborn optimism, is actually not an output, it's an input. It's something that you have to put into your life, or put into an organization, or put into a 190 country international process to get things done. So in other words, we use this part of our PFC, of our prefrontal cortex, through the imagination and the ability to time travel and think about where we want to be in our life individually, or where we want to be collectively as a species. We use language, we use our ability to, and we use this capacity for hope to anticipate and strive for those goals and find realistic pathways to get there. And I think that idea that, so often we're kind of passively waiting and thinking like, well, is it hopeful or is it not hopeful? As if it were like we're just going to look at the facts and say stocks up, stocks down. But obviously, if we approach these massive challenges that we face, like the environmental crisis, in that way, we'll never get the deed done, because there's always a reason to be hopeless and to feel like the challenge is too great. And if we're willing to create realistic goals, realistic pathways, work together and have that social support, then yes, I think that agency is and that hope is realistic and not fantastical.
I'm speaking to Douglas Abrams, who's written this amazing, extraordinary book with Jane Goodall. It's called The Book of Hope. And you just heard him very eloquently say in other words, but unless we are the change we want to see in the world, it's not possible. Peace can only be created by those who are peaceful, not necessarily angry peace activists. Okay, and love can only be shared those who have experienced love and humility and joy and equanimity. And this book takes us through an extraordinary journey. So I just read the headlines from the first section. Here are some more. Reason 1, Jane's 4 reasons for hope, from prehistoric ape to master of the world, half sinner, half saint. There's a phrase, by the way, in Vedanta: the sinner and the saint are merely exchanging notes. The saint has a past, the sinner has a future. So stop judging. A new universal moral code, ape, the resilience of nature, adapt or perish, the power of young people, the indomitable human spirit, and then finally becoming a messenger of hope. And she talks about meaningful coincidences in the end and spiritual evolution and her next great adventure. What is her next great adventure, Doug?
Actually, so we're coming back to our conversation about Lynn, our dear friend, is dying. So Jane was, I asked her what her next great adventure is, and she said that death will be her next great adventure. And Jane actually, we had a fascinating conversation, and it's in the book, about the nature of death and the continuity of consciousness after death, something obviously I know that you care a great deal about and know a great deal about. We worked with I've had the privilege of working with an amazing physician and researcher named Bruce Grayson, who you probably know, who's one of the leaders in the field of near-death studies. And it was fascinating to hear from him that after analyzing thousands of these cases of people who have kind of gone, so to speak, to the other side and beyond and back, that his conclusion is that there is a kind of continuity of consciousness. Jane is a little bit, she does believe that there is consciousness after death, but she's a bit of an agnostic about it. But you can see Jane with her binoculars and her notepad, heading into the afterlife, ready to take notes and send them back to all of us.
So, as I listened to you and I read a bit about that here at the end, about near-death experiences and so on, I'd like to actually conclude our interview by sharing with you that that's my next chapter too. So, in my tradition, what we call 4 ashramas, 4 stages of life. The first 25 years is education. The second 25 years is fame and fortune. The third 25 years is giving back. And the fourth is self-realization and preparation for death. So I meditate on my death every night before I go to sleep. And, I go through this process where I look at my past. I go back as far as I can go. I can go back to a little boy sitting in his mother's lap, and I can smell my mother's skin even now, and hear her singing even now in my awareness. And then I wonder, where did all this go by? I mean, now everything I look back is a dream. Not only my childhood, my adolescence, but yesterday, this morning, it's gone. By the time this conversation is over, it'll be a dream as well. So Wittgenstein said, our life is a dream. We are asleep, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we're dreaming. And Doug, you cannot convince me anymore that this is a physical world. What we call the world physical, or we call a biology physical, is a changing experience in awareness. And the changing experience is a modified form of perception. So I now do not believe the physical world is real. I think it's a dream, as the Buddha said. And it goes by like a dream. And birth and death is happening all the time anyway. Without death, there's no birth. And without birth, there's no death. There's birth and death are simultaneous. And life is not the opposite of death. Life is the continuum of birth and death. And once you understand that, there is enormous peace in this last chapter of life. So I'm very grateful for this conversation. The book, once again, is The Book of Hope, Jane Goodall and Douglas Abrams, A Survival Guide for Trying Times. Check it out, my friends, and stay hopeful, or what's a dream for? Thank you, Doug.
Such a pleasure, Deepak. I just wanted to share that, my dad said, thank you for companioning him on his mighty journey to death. And I just think that what you've said about life and death is beautiful and powerful. And, Jane is 87 now, and she's going strong. So trying to create more hope in this world. So I think there's a lot more for her and for you and for all of us to do to create a more hopeful world. And then, yes, when our time comes, we're off to the next great adventure.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deepak.
Take care.